Hi, folks.
Good morning. Good morning, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us for the annual Governor's Highway Safety Program's St. Patrick's Day Booze It and Lose It campaign kickoff, which is taking place virtually due to COVID-19. We want to thank you for your patience to all of our folks that are joining us as we navigate this particular platform. My name is Miracle King. I'm the Communications Specialist for NCGHSP. Context for the media who are joining us for the very first time: Booze It and Lose It was launched in 1994 to raise awareness while partnering with law enforcement across the state to get drunk drivers off the road. Even with all of our work, about 9,000 lives have been claimed in alcohol-related crashes, and that number continues to rise with marijuana and opioid use. That's why we've asked you all here to help us spread this very important roadway safety messaging and to help us champion this cause. Our esteemed panelists this morning: Director of the NC Governor's Highway Safety Program, Mr. Mark Ezell, Dr. Betsy Tilson, Frontline Voices, Joey Chapatelli and Mira McPeak, Dr. James Larson, and then we also have our data specialist standing by, Mr. Christopher Oliver. A few housekeeping notes for everyone, including the media. Please remain muted until we get to the question and answer portion at the end. Please place your station and call letters and name in the chat box when you want to ask specific questions, which will, at that point in time, you'll be able to unmute, turn your camera on if you'd like to ask that specific question to our esteemed panelists. Without further ado, let's get started with Mr. Mark Ezell. Mark.
Thank you, Miracle, and thank you all for attending today. My name is Mark Ezell, and I'm the director of the North Carolina Governor's Highway Safety Program. And on behalf of Governor Roy Cooper, I welcome you to this kickoff of our St. Patrick's Day Booze It and Lose It campaign. Our office leads efforts to prevent crashes on North Carolina roadways by funding grants and initiatives just like this St. Patrick's Day impaired driving program. Now, impaired driving crashes in North Carolina account for roughly 1/3 of traffic fatalities. We've made headway in this state over the past 20 years in preventing those crashes before they happen, thanks to some strong partnerships that we have with law enforcement, EMS, hospitals, public health, restaurants, and media. But it's not enough. These crashes are 100% preventable, and our strategy is to prevent the crashes before they happen. That's why we're conducting this Booze It and Lose It campaign starting today, March 17th, through Sunday, March 21st. During this campaign, law enforcement agencies from Murphy to Mania will be out in full force, publicizing their presence and conducting increased patrols, removing those impaired drivers from the roadways. This will mirror similar efforts that are occurring across the nation to combat impaired driving during this holiday, which tends to be a fairly significant drinking holiday across the country and in North Carolina specifically. But impaired driving isn't just a law enforcement issue, it's a health issue. As we move ever closer to opening up our schools, businesses, and recreational establishments, we can expect to see increased traffic. But as we work towards slowly but surely getting out of one public health crisis, we can't trade that for another public health crisis, namely impaired driving. That's why today we've invited key health leaders from across the state to help share this message. I want to thank today's kickoff participants, Dr. Betsy Tilson, who is our state health director, members of the UNC Air Care team, and Dr. James Larson with UNC. Each has played a key role in this battle against impaired driving, and we thank you. I'm pleased now to call on Dr. Betsy Tilson, who so ably led our public health efforts in the state's COVID-19 response. Her office has been fantastic partners with us in addressing traffic safety. So Dr. Tilson, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Director Ezel, and thank you to the members of the Governor's Highway Safety Program for shedding light on this very important health issue in our state. Yes, COVID has been dominating most of the public health news, but we know that impaired driving has been, and unfortunately will be, continuing to be a very important health issue. And you're right, as our state eases some of our COVID-19 gathering restrictions, we do expect that people will begin to gather more in restaurants and bars. And today, to maybe even gather to drink green beer and hope that they will have some of the luck of the Irish. But we know, as always, that nobody is lucky when somebody drinks and drives. And according to the Centers for Disease Control, on average, somebody is killed about every 50 minutes in a drunk driving crash, totaling more than 10,000 deaths across the country. In North Carolina, impaired driving fatalities average about 350 deaths in North Carolina. That means almost every single day, somebody in North Carolina dies because of impaired driving. And sometimes it is the driver, but often it is another person, another car, the driver, or even a passenger in the other car. And sadly, many of the times, those are children. So for those of you who've been so good at the 3 W's, wearing your mask, watching your distance, and washing your hands, please make sure that while you're masking up, you're also sobering up before you get behind the wheel of a vehicle. And make sure that if you are driving any sort of vehicle, that your system is free of alcohol or other drugs or mind-altering substances as well that could really limit your ability to drive that car effectively. And do this not just for your own safety, but also for the safety of your fellow North Carolinians that are around you. And so some of the members of our UNC Air Care flight team are joining us now as witnesses to some of these horrific crash scenes repeatedly unfolding in North Carolina roadways on a daily basis. So now I'm going to turn it over to our UNC team.
Hey, good morning. So we were asked to share some of our experiences with, what we've seen. And I can say personally, showing up to an accident and smelling alcohol is one of the worst things, knowing that it could have been prevented.
We see it from some of the counties that we serve, some down in Randolph and more, up to Halifax and Nash counties that we see regularly on the I-95 corridor. And a lot of times it may not even be the person who was drinking most affected at that time. That person's able to walk away, but it's the collateral injuries and deaths in other vehicles with children involved. And so we see that on the front line, and it, it's awful. We hate to be called out to a scene for these kind of cases, and would love to help in any way we can to help educate the public and decrease the need for this, as UNC's mission is to be here and serve the North Carolina public.
Dr. Larson?
Good morning, everybody, and thank you. I've been an emergency physician for more than 20 years working at UNC, and I'm just here to reiterate what you've already heard. I think between the pandemic and a particularly gray winter, I think there's a lot of pent-up energy out there to celebrate, and I think celebration is great, but you got to have a plan if you're going out to celebrate, especially if you're going to be drinking alcohol. And like my Air Care colleagues, the reason we feel so strongly about this is we see what happens when people are driving impaired or intoxicated. But the message I'd like to get out there is your life can change in a second. You can go from somebody who's living their life and able to do what they want to do to being significantly injured. And as Dr. Tilson said, the other thing you have to think about is if you're in a serious accident, it's not just you that's injured. You may cause the injury of other people in your car or somebody in another car or a pedestrian, and you'll have a lifetime of regret over that. And that's something that, again, can change in a second based on decisions that you make. Obviously, there can be financial and legal repercussions based on what you do as well. And finally, with COVID still around, everybody that comes in contact with an accident victim's got to be cognizant of that and use resources that we really don't need to be using if, like Mr. Ezel said, is a completely preventable situation. So the nice thing about this is very easy to avoid. You just have to have a plan if you're going out and celebrating. The first thing is everybody has an app on their phone that can call somebody to come get them if they feel impaired. That's not real hard. You could have a friend with you that could be a designated driver. That's another thing we could do. The other thing is that really, I think your limit should be 0. I think you should not be drinking alcohol and planning on driving with all these other options. And finally, you really can be a hero if you see somebody else that's impaired or intoxicated. You can prevent them from driving and potentially causing a serious accident. So that's the message we want to deliver. Thank you for the opportunity, and I hope everybody has a safe and responsible St. Patrick's Day.
Thank you, Doctor, and thanks to all of our panelists today. To reiterate, this St. Patrick's Day Booze It and Lose It event will be starting today and running through Sunday, and it involves law enforcement agencies from across the state. But it's not simply the enforcement piece that's important. We also are publicizing the importance of driving safe and driving without impairment during this St. Patrick's Day holiday. So we have law enforcement available and there to keep our roads safe, and they will be out in enhanced patrols. But we hope it doesn't come to that. You know, we hope you don't meet one of those law enforcement officers because you are aware that they're out there and taking the appropriate precautions that our panelists have mentioned. It's been a weird year as it relates to traffic safety, just like it's been a weird year for a lot of other things. We have found that the number of fatal crashes in North Carolina, just like in other states, is up this year significantly, despite the fact that our driving is down. So there's a lot of work to do, and we hope that 2020 was just an anomaly, but we don't want to take any chances. So thank you all for participating. We have got over 200 participants on this call with us today, including the media. So Miracle, I'm sure you can facilitate this, but do we have any of those media folks with any questions for us, the panelists today?
All right, thank you so much, Mark. So again, I just want to, for housekeeping's sake, we're going to unmute everyone. And for the media, please just put your name and call letters in the chat box here. We've got, I believe, RAL, WNCT, Spectrum News, SOC, CBS 17, ABC, Fox Carolina, LOS, just to name a few, WCCB Charlotte. And we'll get started off with a few questions with them. And before we get into those questions, for all of the journalists that are on the phone, as well as law enforcement, EMS, firefighters, Mark mentioned that there are almost 200 people registered for this call. And we ask each and every one of you to use what you have at this point in time as we start St. Patrick's Day, which is your voice and your voices online. We ask that you follow us on social media, NCGHSP on Facebook and NC_GHSP on Instagram and Twitter, and reshare that anti-impaired driving messaging. Your voices as the media, law enforcement leaders in your community matter, and they have further cultural influence than just our unit has. So let's get started with some of those questions. We've got one media question says, can you rank the regions of the state by the most deadly as it generally relates to fatal crashes throughout the year, and of course, specifically for holidays like St. Patrick's Day? And Mr. Ezel, will have you or our data specialist kind of lean on this. This is a number that's kind of constantly changing, but generally speaking, there are some pockets that lead the way. Can you talk a little bit about that and where people should be the most mindful?
Well, obviously we need people to be mindful throughout the state. In terms of numbers, The places more likely to have crashes are obviously the places where there are more people. And so we see in our populous counties more impaired driving crashes. However, what's interesting is if you delve in the data a little bit more, North Carolina has a fairly large percentage of fatal crashes on our rural roads. So we need to be very careful on those long stretches of roads across North Carolina, those rural roads where we may see people speeding or driving impaired. While at the same time, we need to be careful, obviously, in the urban areas because there are more people there and more opportunities for folks to be impaired. So it's really difficult for us to pinpoint one area to be more nervous about than another. We just all need to be cognizant of this and take care of ourselves and our neighbors.
Excellent. And again, if you have a question, I see a couple of question marks put into the little bracket that we have here on the side. If you have a specific question, if you can either direct message me, put it in the chat. Another question that we have is kind of a simple one that a lot of folks that will be watching either on the news this evening, will be seeing it on social media, or will be reading it in their local paper, hearing on the radio. I don't drive impaired. No pills, no weed, no alcohol. How do I best protect myself during peak impaired driving seasons? This is a question that may be in the forefront of a lot of folks' mind. They know they can do the best that they can do for themselves. Mr. Ezell, tell us, what do you recommend?
Dr. Larson, you want to take that, or would you like me to?
Sure, happy to. The most important thing you can do is obviously wear your seatbelt. I mean, if you're unfortunately in an accident not caused by yourself or caused by yourself, wearing the seatbelt is the most important thing that you can do. I honestly think that being out, on the weekend at night, you should always be aware where you're driving, but I'm always a little more careful when I'm driving on weekend nights. And I think those are the main things. Wear a seatbelt and always be aware, but be a little bit more careful on those weekend nights and probably tonight as well.
I would agree with all those things. I would say that, especially the seatbelt use that Dr. Larson mentioned. I mean, even if you're involved in a crash, even if you're at fault in the crash, the mere fact that you're wearing a seatbelt will drastically increase your chances of avoiding death or serious injury. So that's vital. The other thing I'd say is people need to be careful to understand what impairment is. It's not just alcohol or illegal drugs. You can take a legal drug, one that's perfectly appropriate for you to take, but inappropriate for you to take before getting behind the wheel of a car. If you take an Ambien at 10 o'clock and then you drive at 11, you are technically in a position to where you can be impaired, and you can be pulled and convicted for driving while impaired, regardless of whether or not the substance is legal or illegal. And you need to be aware of that.
Absolutely. And I don't know if our Air Care team, the UNC Air Care team, wants to lean in on this a little bit. You all, again, are there on the front lines when these particular crashes happen. Mr. Ezell talked about, crashes on rural roadways. Tell us, do you all see, what do you all see during these seasons? Is there a specific uptick in unbelted? Does that kind of match with the impaired driving? And I assume that what Dr. Larson is saying here, the seatbelt is half the battle. What do you all see when you come up on some of those crashes, and what can you all recommend?
Seatbelts are definitely important. We see a lot of people thrown from vehicles in different situations. The other thing is, especially, we also see where an impaired driver may hit pedestrians or bicyclists. We've seen an uptick in having to deal with kids on bikes on the side of the road, or even cyclists, and an impaired person clipping them or hitting them and causing a lot of injury and damage. The only other thing I would add is also is to go along with the see something, say something. You see somebody, driving unsafe, swerving, and trying to do what we can to notify law enforcement and help try to get some of these people off the road before an accident like that happens.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think being mindful of your surroundings as a pedestrian, there's a lot more quiet vehicles with the hybrids out, and also just staying off your cell phone while you're driving so you're able to pay attention and see what's going on around you is the best way to be defensive as you're out there on the roads. If you do have to, drive in the evenings, you're working shift work, coming home late, pay attention to your surroundings, do the best you can to keep yourself safe and out of trouble.
Excellent. Excellent. Okay. So here's another question, and our last one, unless there are any more in the chat. We've seen recent stories about people drinking more during the pandemic. How has this impacted roadway travel, if at all? And there's probably some duality here to this particular question in terms of just overall health of individuals, but specifically behaviors. So I'll put that to you, Mr. Ezell, and of course, Dr. Tilson as well, if you want to weigh in on this, especially as it relates to the pandemic.
Yeah, I can tackle some of the increased substance use during a pandemic, and then I'll turn it over to Dr. Ezell and talk about how that relates into data. I think with COVID, this has really been a year of trauma for our state. Some of it is trauma when we think about car crashes. Some of it is trauma in terms of emotional, mental health, stress in families, stress on people. We know when there's an economic downturn, when there's a crisis, we know that rates of substance use disorder goes up. And so we know, also looking at our rates of people who are coming to the emergency department for opioid overuse, right? We're talking about alcohol, but also we were talking about there's other drugs and substances that are going on. So we know we've had an uptick in people in using opioids. We know there's an uptick in people using alcohol. That's expected, unfortunately, when people go through a crisis like this. So it's even more important now to really think about impaired driving, because those rates of substance use disorders are going up as a result of the trauma of this pandemic. So how that relates to our data, I will turn that over to Director Ezell.
Well, that's exactly right, Dr. Tilson. Thank you. We're seeing similar patterns. I think we talk and think a lot about distracted driving, but during the course of the pandemic, we've seen what I think is emotionally distracted driving. People aren't so much distracted by their cell phones or by, music in the car, as they are distracted by their own thoughts, their worries about their family, their friends, their health. And as a result, we're seeing increased speeding. We're seeing an increase in the number of people who aren't wearing their seatbelts, simple behaviors that probably were not as significant prior to the pandemic. And so we're seeing an increase in those types of crashes, while at the same time seeing a decrease in the actual vehicle miles traveled. So it's an odd phenomenon. But as also mentioned, we're seeing an increase in bicyclist related crashes and pedestrian related crashes, largely because people have been out. People have been, and that's a great thing. That is a positive health behavior. People have been out riding their bikes and doing a little bit more walking. But when you combine that with impaired driving, if it is a bicycle or a pedestrian versus a 2,000-pound guided missile guided by someone who's impaired, it can end very badly for the bicyclist and for the pedestrian. So it has been certainly an odd year. I think substance use disorder has clearly been on the rise, as Dr. Tilson mentioned, and that has reflected itself in some of our numbers. But a lot of that, I think, is also just emotional distraction. People need to pay attention, count to 5 or 10 before they even turn the ignition in the car. That can help a great deal.
Excellent, excellent. Okay, well, what we would like to do here is just make sure before we do dismiss the panel to allow anyone else that wants to weigh in their questions to do so. The Governor's Highway Safety Program will be sending out some messaging today post this particular presentation with some data. Numbers do not lie, okay? And so we want to make sure that we show the public some numbers that reflect these trends that we're talking about. So for the media that's on board, we want to make sure that you all take a look at some of that data that we release later today. And of course, we just want to thank everyone that's participating today. Folks think that they may not have an influence, but it's groups like this getting together for a moment and pressing forward together that really can influence our culture. This is a cultural and behavioral and health issue. So we just want to reiterate again that if you all use your voices, each one of you, whether it be law enforcement that's on this call, first responders, firefighters, the admins that are joining from various offices, use your voice. Follow GHSP on Facebook. You can do that right now before you go to your next 9 o'clock meeting. I'm sure you all have. Follow us on Facebook. Follow us on Twitter. It's NC_GHSP. And just reshare the messages. That takes a couple of seconds. That's one of the biggest things that you can do if you're someone that's believing in this particular cause. We also, if you all want to post your own personal message, do so. Use the hashtag KeysFreeNC. We want that to trend, not just on St. Patrick's Day, but every day of the year. There's no reason. Impaired driving, like the experts have said, is a 100% preventable behavior. So we want everyone that considers getting behind the wheel to go keys free if they've been impaired. Mr. Ezell, if you want to send everyone off, we will do so at this point in time.
Thank you all very much for participating. Please drive safe, and we look forward to continuing our wonderful partnership. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Good job, everyone. Thanks.
Thank you.